In the early months of 1942, as World War II raged in Europe and the Pacific, for the people of mainland USA, for the most part, life must have been carrying on as usual. To those living here in beautiful Santa Barbara, California, the war would still have felt remote and abstract, a conflict that posed no real threat to the people personally. But that all changed on the night of February 23rd, 1942, when a shadow emerged off the coast behind me and shattered any sense of security they had in one fell swoop. This was the bombardment of Elwood oil field in Southern California. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the World Strider channel, where we talk about the outdoors as well as Japanese history and culture. Now, I'm currently back in my hometown of Santa Barbara, California, and to be honest, I debated whether or not to make a video while I was home visiting my family, because, you know, my wheelhouse is sort of topics related to Japan and Japanese history, and I just didn't really feel it would be appropriate to film something back home. However, one of my brothers reminded me of a little known and very interesting incident that took place in the early years of World War II that I thought would be really fascinating to share with my audience. So let's tell the tale. Okay, so let's start our tale with a little bit of background and context. In late February of 1942, the Empire of Japan was at the peak of its power in the Pacific. They had dealt the infamous blow to the Americans at Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941, and in the months following that, they had swept through all of Southeast Asia and most of the Pacific. They had even kicked the Americans out of the Philippines several weeks prior in early February of 1942, which was at the time a US colony. In addition to all of this, the Japanese government had sent a handful of submarines to harass the western coast of the United States, doing things like attacking merchant ships and generally disrupting shipping. But none of these submarines had actually attacked or were instructed to attack any targets on the shore. And by the end of December, most of them had returned to friendly waters closer to Japan, all except one. This submarine was the I-17, commanded by a Kozo Nishino. Now, there's a popular story about him that goes that he had actually visited the Elwood oil field prior to the war as part of the crew of a merchant ship picking up oil to bring back to Japan. The story continues and says things like he was slighted by the Americans on shore in some way, and that the attack by his submarine during World War II was some sort of revenge mission. But this has actually been proven to be a myth, so if you've heard this story, just know that it's not true, or it's highly unlikely that it's true, because Kozo Nishino, after graduating from the Naval Academy in Japan, went directly into the Navy, so there would have been no time for him to have commanded some sort of merchant vessel visiting the US or traveling to US waters. In any case, Kozo Nishino was given orders to attack the Elwood oil field on the night of February 23rd, 1942. Interestingly, his orders were to attack during one of President Roosevelt's famous fireside chats. Why exactly they chose to launch an attack during one of his speeches is a subject for debate, but it's possible they were concerned about the morale boost that it could give the American public. It's also possible they figured the US military would have a more difficult time coordinating an effective response if they were distracted by the president's speech. Another interesting question to consider is why they chose Elwood oil field at all. Because these days, although it is still an active oil field, it's not exactly an important strategic location for America. But back in the 1930s, it was much more productive and it was a much more important source of oil for the US. Still, there were more vital oil targets either up north in San Francisco or down south in Los Angeles that the submarine could have targeted instead. However, unlike these two more enticing targets, the Elwood oil field had no real military presence nearby to speak of, making it a safer bet. But interestingly, according to some sources, there normally would have been a military presence near the Elwood oil field. For instance, at the nearby Goleta Airport, a Marine bomber group was stationed there. Additionally, there was an artillery piece stationed near the shore. And on top of that, there was a Coast Guard patrol. But mysteriously, in the weeks and days leading up to the attack, these were all moved somewhere else. And finally, the big question that I had, and if you're anything like me, you were probably asking, why would they choose to attack this location with a submarine? Sure, getting actual destroyers or large ships into American waters would have been a lot more risky and challenging, but a submarine isn't really designed to be attacking shore targets, at least not that effectively. This particular submarine, the I-17, had a single 14 centimeter or 5.5 inch deck gun. A powerful weapon, sure, but with a single sub and a single gun, it was not really going to be all that effective against a shore target at night. So I think it's clear that the intention was not to cause any real damage to the United States or create any sort of real economic impact, but it was more meant as a psychological attack. So, to the attack itself. At around 7 p.m. on the 23rd, Nishino ordered the submarine to surface opposite the Elwood oil field. He ordered his men to ready the deck gun, and they waited for about 15 minutes before opening fire. The crew took aim at a large fuel tank and fired several rounds that landed near a storage facility, so not off to the best of starts. At this time of night, most of the crew of the oil field had gone home for the day, but there was still a skeleton staff on hand, and at first they thought that there was some sort of internal explosion, and they didn't really know what was going on. Eventually, a crew member by the name of G. Brown spotted the submarine off the coast, and he later told reporters that it looked so big to him and so ominous that he thought it must have been a destroyer or a cruiser or something like that, until he noticed that only one gun was firing. Then it became pretty clear it was just a submarine. Soon, Nishino ordered his men to take aim at another oil tank, because they weren't having much effect on the first one. And as the firing continued, one of the rounds sailed over a nearby inn. I don't think the inn is still there, but the owner of the inn saw what was happening, and he called the local sheriff's department, who assured him that some warplanes were on the way. But these warplanes never showed up for whatever reason. I'm not sure if it was just a lie that he told the innkeeper, or maybe there was a miscommunication at some point along the way. Who knows? Estimates vary as to how many shells were fired from the submarine in total that night, anywhere from 12 to 25. According to a sign that stands on the beach today, 25 were fired in total. However, in my research, I found that B-1 class submarines typically carried a payload of 17 shells in a waterproof container, and that all of them were discharged that night. So I personally think 17 were fired, but if you believe the sign, it's 25. I think it's possible that surveying the damage on the shore after the fact and hearing people's accounts, they could come to the conclusion that it was 25. But in fact, it's probably closer to 17 in my opinion. After about 20 minutes of firing, Nishino gave the order to cease fire. The submarine receded beneath the waves and disappeared from the scene. So that's the story. Not exactly the most significant military engagement in the history of warfare, but thankfully no one was killed, and the actual oil field only sustained minor damage. Elwood Pier, which still stands today, was damaged, as well as a catwalk, and a pump house and oil derrick were destroyed. That was pretty much the extent of the damage. At the time, it was estimated to be about $500 worth of damage in total. The rounds the sub was equipped with were never designed to be bombarding shore targets. They weren't particularly explosive. They were more designed to take out other ships, so basically ship-to-ship warfare. So really, going into it, Nishino and his crew would have known that they weren't going to cause significant damage to the shore anyway. So if this was such an insignificant engagement, why am I even talking about it at all? Well, I think it was important for several reasons. First, although Nishino and his crew did not succeed in causing widespread economic damage to the United States, they did ultimately succeed in their purpose. And that was to sow fear and discord among the general US populace, but also within the military establishment itself. Nowhere was this more evident than in the infamous Battle of Los Angeles, an event that took place a day after the bombardment. During this engagement, the US military proceeded to fire anti-aircraft rounds into the sky at nothing for a period of several hours. Somewhere in their fear and hysteria, they got the idea that the Japanese were invading or were attacking Los Angeles. And in the long term, the attack on Elwood was also used as yet another justification for interning Japanese Americans during the war. which we all know was a shameful chapter in American history. Additionally, there were those at the time who believed the entire thing was just a conspiracy manufactured by the US government. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now, of course, as terror tactics often do, it also had the effect of galvanizing the population towards the war effort. There was an uptick in the number of war bonds purchased after the attack, as well as enlistment rates. Second, the attack marked the first time that the mainland US had been attacked by a foreign power since the War of 1812, and it was the first time during World War II as well. And finally, I think it was important because it's just a really interesting little tidbit of history that a lot of people don't know about, and it's a source of pride for us Santa Barbarans. It's kind of a claim to fame of ours, if you will. Well, there you have it. That's the story of the bombardment of Elwood oil field. If you have anything to add to the story, if you've been to the site, or if there's any information that you know about that I left out, please feel free to mention it in the comments, as well as any suggestions you have for future videos. I'm always open ears. And finally, if you like content like this and you'd like to see more of it in the future, please consider liking and subscribing. Until next time, everyone. Take care.